Marcus had always been a heavy sleeper, but today was different. The steady hum of the airplane engines created the perfect lullaby as he sat in row 12, his Royal Guard uniform slightly wrinkled from the long journey. His ceremonial sword rested carefully in the overhead compartment, and his polished boots reflected the cabin lights even as his eyes grew heavy. The flight from London to Dubai was supposed to be routine. Marcus was escorting a minor royal family member to an important diplomatic meeting. Princess Catherine sat 3 rows ahead, completely absorbed in her paperwork, occasionally glancing out the window at the clouds below. She had specifically requested Marcus for this mission because of his reputation for being alert and dependable. If only she could see him now. Marcus's head tilted to one side as sleep overtook him. The other passengers barely noticed the uniformed man catching up on much-needed rest. He had been working double shifts for weeks preparing for this important assignment. The royal family's security detail had been stretched thin lately, and Marcus had volunteered for extra duties without complaint. The airplane cruised smoothly at 35,000 feet. Captain Reynolds and First Officer Harrison were experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours between them. They had flown this route dozens of times, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The weather was clear, air traffic was light, and their instruments showed all systems functioning properly. In the galley, Flight Attendant Sarah Mitchell was preparing the meal service when she noticed something unusual. Captain Reynolds appeared at the galley entrance, his face pale and his hand pressed against his chest. He was breathing heavily and looked distressed. "Are you all right, Captain?" Sarah asked, immediately concerned by his appearance. "I think I'm having chest pains," Reynolds whispered, not wanting to alarm the passengers. "It started about 10 minutes ago and it's getting worse." Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She helped the captain to a crew seat and called for the senior flight attendant. Within minutes, the entire crew was aware of the situation. They moved quickly but quietly, not wanting to create panic among the 150 passengers on board. First Officer Harrison was radioing air traffic control when the situation took a dramatic turn for the worse. Captain Reynolds collapsed in the galley, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. The crew immediately began emergency medical procedures, but it was clear that the captain was having a serious heart attack. "We need to declare a medical emergency," Harrison told air traffic control through his headset. His voice remained calm and professional, but inside he was fighting panic. He was qualified to fly the aircraft, but landing this large passenger jet would be incredibly challenging without his experienced captain. The senior flight attendant made a difficult decision. She grabbed the intercom microphone and spoke to the passengers with as much calm as she could manage. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a medical emergency on board. If there are any pilots or aviation professionals among our passengers, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately." The announcement sent a ripple of concern through the cabin. Passengers looked around nervously, whispering to each other about what might be happening. Princess Catherine looked up from her papers with worry, glancing back toward where Marcus was supposed to be keeping watch. Several passengers pressed their call buttons, but none were qualified pilots. A retired air traffic controller offered to help with radio communications. A flight instructor volunteered his knowledge, but he had never flown anything larger than a small training aircraft. The crew was growing desperate when Sarah remembered seeing the uniformed guard earlier. Military personnel sometimes had aviation training, especially those assigned to protect important officials. She hurried down the aisle toward row 12, hoping against hope that this guard might have some useful experience. What she found was Marcus, still fast asleep despite all the commotion. His head had fallen back against the seat, and he was snoring softly. The irony wasn't lost on her that the one person who might be able to help was completely unaware of the crisis unfolding around him. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, gently shaking Marcus's shoulder. "Sir, we need you to wake up. This is very important." Marcus stirred slowly, his eyes opening gradually as he tried to focus on the flight attendant's worried face. For a moment he looked confused about where he was, then suddenly remembered his duty. He straightened up immediately, his training taking over. "What's wrong?" he asked, instantly alert. "Is Princess Catherine safe?" "The princess is fine," Sarah assured him quickly. "But we have a serious problem. Our captain has had a heart attack, and we desperately need someone with aviation experience. Please tell me you have some kind of pilot training." Marcus's mind raced as he processed this information. He did have pilot training, but it was from his military service years ago. He had flown transport helicopters and small fixed-wing aircraft during his time in the Royal Air Force before joining the Palace Guard. But flying a commercial airliner was completely different from anything he had ever done. "I have some flying experience," he admitted carefully, "but not with anything this large. I flew helicopters and small planes in the military, but that was over 8 years ago." Sarah's face showed a mixture of relief and continued worry. "Right now, you're the closest thing we have to a qualified pilot. The first officer is good, but he's never had to handle an emergency landing of this magnitude alone. He specifically asked if we could find anyone with aviation experience to assist him." Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, his mind shifting into crisis mode. He had been trained to handle emergencies, though nothing quite like this. As he followed Sarah toward the front of the aircraft, he caught sight of Princess Catherine watching him with concern. "Stay calm, Your Highness," he said as they passed her row. "Everything will be fine." But as Marcus approached the cockpit door, he wasn't entirely sure he believed his own words. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. 150 lives, including that of the princess he was sworn to protect, now depended on skills he hadn't used in nearly a decade. The flight attendant opened the cockpit door, and Marcus got his first look at the complex array of instruments, switches and displays that controlled the massive aircraft. First Officer Harrison turned around, hope and desperation evident in his eyes. "Please tell me you know something about flying," Harrison said urgently. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped into the cockpit, knowing that the next few hours would test every ounce of training and courage he possessed. Marcus settled into the captain's seat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the armrests. The cockpit felt overwhelming with its countless buttons, switches, and digital displays. Everything was so much more complex than the military aircraft he remembered. The screens showed numbers and symbols that meant life or death for everyone on board. "Talk me through what we're dealing with," Marcus said to First Officer Harrison, forcing his voice to remain steady. His military training had taught him that panic was the enemy in any crisis situation. Harrison quickly explained their current status while keeping one eye on the instruments. "We're cruising at 35,000 feet, about 2 hours from Dubai. The aircraft is stable, but we need to start planning for an emergency landing. I can handle most of the flying, but I've never dealt with anything like this without an experienced captain." Marcus nodded, trying to recall everything he had learned about aviation during his service years. The principles of flight were the same whether you were in a helicopter, a small plane, or this massive passenger jet. Lift, thrust, drag, and weight still governed everything that flew. "What about the captain?" Marcus asked, glancing back toward the cabin. "The crew is doing everything they can," Harrison replied grimly. "But he's unconscious, and we can't risk waiting for him to recover. We need to assume we're on our own." The radio crackled to life as air traffic control contacted them with updates and instructions. Marcus listened carefully as Harrison communicated their situation to ground control. Emergency services were being mobilized at their destination airport, and other aircraft were being diverted to give them priority landing clearance. "The good news is that this aircraft practically flies itself," Harrison explained, pointing to the autopilot controls. "The computer systems handle most of the routine flying. But landing is different. That requires human judgment and experience." Marcus examined the flight instruments more carefully. The altimeter showed their height, the airspeed indicator displayed their velocity, and the artificial horizon revealed the aircraft's orientation. These were familiar concepts, even if the specific instruments were more advanced than what he remembered. "I need you to walk me through the landing procedures," Marcus said, step by step, as if I've never seen them before. Harrison began explaining the complex sequence of events required for a safe landing. They would need to begin their descent at the right time and rate. The landing gear would have to be lowered at the proper altitude. The flaps and slats would need to be extended to slow the aircraft. Speed, altitude, and approach angle all had to be precisely coordinated. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the flight crew was dealing with increasingly anxious passengers. The senior flight attendant had made another announcement explaining that they were dealing with a medical emergency and would be making an unscheduled landing in Dubai. She assured everyone that the situation was under control, but many passengers could sense that something serious was happening. Princess Catherine had figured out that Marcus was no longer in his assigned seat. She approached the senior flight attendant with concern etched on her face. "Where is my security detail?" she asked quietly. Marcus was supposed to be watching over me during this flight. The flight attendant hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "He's assisting with the emergency situation, Your Highness. He has aviation experience that we desperately needed." Catherine's eyes widened as she realized the implications. "Are you telling me that my bodyguard is flying this airplane?" "He's helping the first officer," the attendant clarified. "The captain became ill, and your guard was the only person on board with any pilot training." Back in the cockpit, Marcus was getting a crash course in flying a commercial airliner. Harrison showed him how to read the navigation displays, explained the autopilot settings, and walked him through the radio procedures. Marcus absorbed the information like a sponge, his military training helping him process complex technical details quickly. "The most critical part will be the final approach," Harrison explained. "We'll need to maintain exactly the right speed and descent rate. Too fast and we'll overshoot the runway. Too slow and we'll stall. The margin for error is very small." Marcus studied the approach charts for Dubai International Airport. The runway layout, elevation, and approach paths were clearly marked, but translating that information into a successful landing would be the challenge of his lifetime. "What's our fuel situation?" Marcus asked, thinking like the military pilot he used to be. "We have enough for one approach," Harrison replied. "Maybe two if we're very careful, but we can't afford to waste fuel on multiple landing attempts." The weight of responsibility pressed down on Marcus even harder. In the military, his mistakes had consequences, but usually only for himself and his immediate crew. Now he was responsible for 150 innocent lives, including a member of the royal family he had sworn to protect. "There's something else," Harrison continued. "The weather in Dubai is deteriorating. There's a sandstorm approaching the airport. We need to get there before visibility drops too low for a safe landing." Marcus felt a bead of sweat form on his forehead despite the cool cockpit air. Every factor seemed to be working against them. An inexperienced crew, challenging weather conditions, and the pressure of time all combined to create the perfect storm of difficulty. "How long until we need to start our descent?" Marcus asked. Harrison checked their position and calculated the distance to Dubai. "About 40 minutes. That gives us time to practice some basic maneuvers and get you more familiar with the controls." They spent the next half hour with Harrison, teaching Marcus how to make small adjustments to the aircraft's heading and altitude. Marcus was surprised by how responsive the big jet was to his inputs. The computer systems helped smooth out his movements, but he could feel the massive aircraft responding to his commands. "You're getting the hang of it," Harrison said with some relief in his voice. "Your military background is definitely showing. You have good instincts for flying." But Marcus knew that instincts alone wouldn't be enough. Landing this aircraft safely would require precision, timing, and more than a little luck. As they approached the point where they would need to begin their descent toward Dubai, he said a silent prayer for everyone on board. The radio crackled again as air traffic control provided updated weather information. The sandstorm was moving faster than expected, and they would be landing in marginal visibility conditions. Marcus gripped the controls tighter, knowing that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing. "Are you ready for this?" Harrison asked, his hand hovering over the controls that would begin their descent. Marcus took a deep breath and nodded. There was no turning back now. In a few minutes, they would be committed to an approach that would either save everyone on board or end in disaster. The sleeping royal guard from row 12 was about to become the most important pilot in the sky. "Dubai Control. This is Flight 447 requesting priority landing clearance." Harrison spoke into his radio headset while Marcus watched the desert landscape slowly grow larger below them. They had begun their descent 20 minutes ago, and every moment brought them closer to the most challenging few minutes of their lives. Marcus's hands were steady on the controls now, though his heart was racing. The aircraft was responding well to his inputs, and Harrison's constant guidance was helping him understand the subtle differences between military flying and commercial aviation. The autopilot was still handling most of the work, but Marcus knew that would change once they got closer to the airport. "Flight 447, you are cleared for emergency approach runway 30 left, came the reply from Dubai Air Traffic Control. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Weather update. Visibility 2 kilometers in blowing sand. Winds gusting to 25 knots from the southwest. Acknowledged, Dubai Control, Harrison replied, then turned to Marcus. Those wind conditions are going to make this interesting. We'll need to approach with extra speed to compensate for the gusts, but not so much that we can't stop on the runway. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft beginning its descent. The change in engine noise and the subtle sensation of going downward caused many people to grip their armrests tighter. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, checking that seatbelts were fastened and trying to project an air of calm confidence. Princess Catherine sat rigidly in her seat, her usual composure cracking slightly as she realized that her protection officer was literally flying the airplane she was riding in. She had known Marcus for 2 years and respected his professionalism, but she had no idea he possessed aviation skills. The thought that her life was in the hands of someone she knew personally made the situation feel both more reassuring and more terrifying. "Your Highness," the senior flight attendant approached her seat. "The captain asked me to tell you that we're beginning our approach to Dubai. Landing should occur in approximately 20 minutes. How is Marcus doing?" Catherine asked quietly. "From what I understand, he's performing admirably under the circumstances," the attendant replied. "The first officer says his military training is really showing." Back in the cockpit, Marcus was getting his first real look at Dubai International Airport through the windscreen. Even through the haze of blowing sand, he could see the parallel runways stretching out across the desert. The airport looked massive compared to the small military airfields he remembered. "See those lights along the runway?" Harrison pointed through the windscreen. "Those will guide us down to the correct approach angle. We need to follow that glide path exactly, or we'll either come in too high or too low." Marcus studied the approach lighting system, trying to memorize the visual references he would need. The military had taught him to rely on instruments, but Harrison explained that visual cues were crucial during the final moments of landing. "What's our current altitude?" Marcus asked, scanning the instrument panel. 15,000 feet and descending at 1,800 feet per minute, Harrison replied. "We're right on target for timing, but we'll need to slow our descent rate as we get lower." The radio filled with communications between air traffic control and other aircraft. Marcus could hear that several flights were being diverted to other airports because of their emergency. The knowledge that dozens of other planes were being inconvenienced because of their situation added to the pressure he was feeling. Flight 447, turn left heading 280 degrees for final approach, air traffic control, instructed. Harrison made the turn while explaining to Marcus how the banking maneuver affected their approach speed and descent rate. Every action had multiple consequences in commercial aviation, and Marcus was beginning to appreciate the complexity of safely flying such a large aircraft. 10,000 feet, Harrison announced. "This is where we start configuring for landing. We need to extend the flaps to increase lift and slow down our approach speed." Marcus watched as Harrison operated the flap controls, feeling the aircraft's handling characteristics change as the wing surfaces extended. The plane felt more stable but also more sluggish in its responses. At 8,000 feet, they encountered the first effects of the approaching sandstorm. Turbulence shook the aircraft and visibility began to decrease noticeably. Marcus gripped the controls tighter as the plane bounced and swayed in the unstable air. "This is normal for desert flying," Harrison assured him, though his own knuckles were white as he held his controls. "The sand creates thermal updrafts and downdrafts. Just maintain steady pressure on the controls and don't overreact to the bumps." 5,000 feet extending landing gear, Harrison announced. Marcus felt and heard the mechanical sounds as the massive wheels lowered into position beneath them. The aircraft's drag increased significantly, requiring constant adjustments to maintain their approach speed. Through the increasingly hazy air, Marcus could now clearly see Dubai International Airport spread out before them. The runway looked impossibly narrow from their current altitude, though he knew it was actually quite wide. Emergency vehicles were visible along the sides of the runway, their red and blue lights flashing in the sandy air. 3,000 feet, Harrison called out. "This is where you take primary control. I'll handle the radio and monitor instruments, but the flying is up to you now." Marcus felt the weight of the controls transfer to his hands. The aircraft was completely under his command now, responding to every tiny movement he made. 150 lives depended on his ability to guide this massive machine safely to the ground. "Remember," Harrison coached, "small inputs, stay ahead of the aircraft, and trust your instruments. The runway is 4,000 meters long, so we have plenty of stopping distance even if the landing isn't perfect." At 2,000 feet, They were fully committed to the approach. There would be no turning back now unless something went seriously wrong. Marcus could see individual buildings around the airport, and the runway markings were becoming clearly visible despite the blowing sand. "Looking good," Harrison encouraged. "Speed is right on target, descent rate is perfect." "You're doing great." But Marcus could feel the wind gusts buffeting the aircraft more strongly as they got lower. Each gust threatened to push them off their intended path, requiring constant corrections to stay aligned with the runway centerline. 1,000 feet, Harrison announced. Final approach phase. This is it. Marcus's world narrowed down to the essential elements: airspeed, altitude, runway alignment, and descent rate. Everything else faded away as he focused every bit of his training and instincts on the most important landing of his life. In just a few more minutes, he would either be a hero or responsible for a tragedy that would haunt him forever. At 800 feet above the ground, Marcus could see individual vehicles racing along the airport perimeter roads. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned strategically along the runway, their crews ready for whatever might happen in the next crucial minutes. The sight of all those emergency responders made the gravity of the situation crystal clear. 500 feet, Harrison called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "You're slightly right of centerline. Small correction to the left." Marcus made a gentle adjustment, feeling the aircraft respond immediately to his input. The runway was growing larger in the windscreen with each passing second. He could now see the touchdown zone markings clearly, even through the sandy haze that was getting thicker as the storm approached. The wind gusts were becoming more unpredictable at this lower altitude. One moment the aircraft felt stable and controlled. The next it would lurch sideways as a crosswind caught the massive vertical stabilizer. Marcus had to fight the urge to overcorrect, remembering Harrison's advice about making small, smooth inputs. 400 feet looking perfect, Harrison encouraged. Speed 145 knots, descent rate 650 feet per minute. Textbook approach. In the cabin, passengers could feel the aircraft descending more rapidly now. Many were gripping their armrests and looking anxiously out the windows at the ground rushing up to meet them. The flight attendants had taken their seats for landing, but their trained eyes were watching for any signs that passengers might panic. Princess Catherine found herself holding her breath as she felt the aircraft making what seemed like constant small adjustments. She had flown hundreds of times in her life, but had never paid such close attention to every subtle movement of the aircraft. Knowing that Marcus was at the controls made every sensation feel magnified. 300 feet, Harrison announced. Start reducing power slightly. We want to be at landing speed when we cross the runway threshold. Marcus gently pulled back on the throttles, feeling the engine's thrust decrease. The aircraft's descent rate increased slightly, bringing them down the final portion of the glide path toward the runway. His eyes moved constantly between the instruments and the approaching runway, cross-checking everything Harrison had taught him. At 200 feet, they encountered a strong downdraft that pushed the aircraft below their intended glide path. Marcus felt the plane sink faster than it should, and warning signals began chirping in the cockpit. "Power, power," Harrison called out urgently. "We're getting low." Marcus pushed the throttles forward, adding thrust to arrest their rapid descent. The engines responded with a surge of power, but there was a delay as the massive turbofan spooled up to higher speed. For several terrifying seconds it seemed like they might fall short of the runway. "Come on," Marcus muttered under his breath, willing the aircraft to respond. His military training had prepared him for emergency situations, but the stakes had never been this high. Every person in the cabin was counting on his ability to recover from this critical moment. The additional power finally took effect, and their descent rate decreased back to normal. But now they were approaching the runway at a slightly higher speed than planned, which meant they would need more distance to stop after touchdown. 100 feet, Harrison called out. "You've got it back. Looking good now." Marcus could see the runway numbers painted on the asphalt directly ahead. The precision approach path indicators on the side of the runway showed they were back on the correct glide slope. The touchdown zone was rushing toward them at 150 miles per hour. 50 feet, Harrison announced. "Start the flare, now!" Marcus began pulling back gently on the controls, raising the aircraft's nose to reduce their descent rate for landing. This was the most critical moment of the entire flight. Too much flare and they would balloon back up into the air. Too little and they would hit the runway too hard, potentially damaging the landing gear or worse. 30 feet. 20 feet. 10 feet. Harrison counted down. The main landing gear touched the runway with a solid thump that reverberated throughout the aircraft. Marcus immediately deployed the speed brakes and reverse thrust, while keeping the aircraft rolling straight down the center line. The nose gear settled onto the runway a few seconds later, and they were officially on the ground. "We're down," Harrison shouted with relief and excitement. "Fantastic job. Now let's get this thing stopped." Marcus applied the wheel brakes carefully, feeling the massive aircraft beginning to decelerate. The runway stretched out ahead of them for what seemed like miles, giving them plenty of room to come to a safe stop. Emergency vehicles were racing alongside the runway, ready to respond if needed. In the cabin, passengers erupted in spontaneous applause as they realized they had landed safely. The flight attendants were smiling with relief, and several passengers were wiping tears from their eyes. The tension that had built up during the emergency was finally being released. Princess Catherine felt her shoulders relax for the first time in hours. She had complete faith in Marcus's abilities as a bodyguard, but she had never imagined he would also save her life as a pilot. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man assigned to protect her from external threats had ended up protecting her from a threat none of them had anticipated. "Speed down to 50 knots," Harrison reported as they continued rolling down the runway. "We can make the turnoff at Taxiway Delta and head to the gate." Marcus was amazed at how anticlimactic the actual moment of landing had been after all the stress and preparation. One moment they were flying, the next they were simply a very large vehicle rolling down a very long road. His hands were shaking slightly now that the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. "How did I do?" Marcus asked Harrison as they slowed to taxi speed. "Better than most commercial pilots I've flown with," Harrison replied with genuine admiration. "You kept your cool under pressure, made good decisions, and executed a perfect landing in challenging conditions. The airline industry could use more pilots like you." As they turned off the runway and began taxiing toward the terminal, Marcus could see the emergency vehicles following them. Medical personnel were standing by to attend to Captain Reynolds, who was still unconscious but stable in the cabin. The crisis was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. "Dubai Ground Control. Flight 447 is clear of the runway and proceeding to Gate 15, Harrison radioed. "Emergency is over. We'll need medical personnel to meet the aircraft for our captain." "Roger, Flight 447, came the reply. "Outstanding job bringing everyone home safely. Medical teams are standing by at the gate." Marcus slumped back in the captain's seat, suddenly feeling exhausted. The last few hours had demanded every ounce of his mental and physical energy. He had gone from sleeping peacefully in row 12 to successfully landing a commercial airliner in emergency conditions. It was definitely not how he had planned to spend his flight to Dubai. As they approached the gate, Marcus could see news crews and airport officials gathering to meet their aircraft. Word of their emergency landing had apparently spread quickly, and the media was eager to cover the story of the Royal Guard who had become an unlikely hero at 35,000 feet. The aircraft came to a complete stop at Gate 15, and Marcus finally released his grip on the controls. His hands were cramped from holding them so tightly during the approach and landing. The steady hum of the engines wound down as Harrison began the shutdown procedures, methodically turning off systems according to the checklist. "Ladies and gentlemen," the senior flight attendant announced over the intercom, "welcome to Dubai International Airport. Please remain seated while medical personnel board the aircraft to attend to our captain. We want to thank you for your patience and cooperation during today's emergency." Through the cockpit windows, Marcus could see medical teams rushing toward the aircraft with stretchers and emergency equipment. Airport fire crews were positioned nearby as a precaution, though their services were thankfully no longer needed. The sandstorm was getting worse, with visibility dropping significantly across the airport. "We need to get Captain Reynolds to the hospital immediately," Harrison said, unbuckling his harness. "His condition hasn't improved during the flight." Marcus stood up slowly, his legs feeling unsteady after hours of intense concentration. The cockpit that had seemed so foreign and intimidating just a few hours ago now felt familiar. Every switch and display had become part of his temporary world as he learned to fly the massive aircraft. Medical personnel entered the cockpit within minutes of the aircraft stopping. They quickly assessed Captain Reynolds' condition and began preparing him for transport to the hospital. The captain was still unconscious, but his vital signs had stabilized during the flight thanks to the crew's first aid efforts. "Excuse me," one of the paramedics said to Marcus, "are you the passenger who helped fly the aircraft?" Yes, I assisted the first officer during the emergency, Marcus replied modestly. Well, you probably saved this man's life by getting him to medical care so quickly, the paramedic said. That was an outstanding piece of flying under pressure. As the medical team worked to move Captain Reynolds from the aircraft, Marcus gathered his thoughts about what had just happened. He had gone from being a passenger to being responsible for everyone's safety in a matter of minutes. The transition had been so rapid that he was only now beginning to process the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Princess Catherine appeared at the cockpit door, having waited for the medical emergency to be handled before approaching. Her usual royal composure was intact, but Marcus could see genuine emotion in her eyes. Marcus, she said quietly, I don't have adequate words to thank you for what you've done today. You saved everyone on this aircraft, including me. I was just doing my job, Your Highness, Marcus replied, though they both knew this situation had gone far beyond his normal duties as a royal protection officer. Your job is to keep me safe on the ground, Catherine smiled. I'm quite certain that flying commercial aircraft wasn't covered in your training manual. Harrison approached them, carrying the flight data recorder that would be needed for the official investigation. Your Highness, your security officer performed magnificently today. I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen someone adapt to emergency conditions so quickly. Airport officials were waiting in the jet bridge as passengers began disembarking. Marcus could see news cameras and reporters gathering in the terminal beyond, clearly eager to interview the participants in the dramatic emergency landing. The story of a royal guard becoming an emergency pilot was already spreading through social media and news outlets. Marcus, Princess Catherine said as they prepared to leave the aircraft, I think our diplomatic mission just became much more complicated. This story is going to be international news within hours. She was right. As they entered the terminal, Marcus could see CNN and BBC News crews setting up equipment. Airport security was working to keep reporters at a distance, but the media attention was unavoidable. The story had everything journalists loved: drama, heroism, royalty, and a happy ending. The airport manager approached them with a small entourage of officials. Your Highness, Mr. Marcus, on behalf of Dubai International Airport, I want to express our gratitude for your handling of today's emergency. We've prepared a private lounge where you can rest while we arrange your onward travel. As they walked through the terminal, Marcus noticed how other passengers from their flight were looking at him with expressions of gratitude and admiration. Several approached to shake his hand and thank him personally for getting them safely to the ground. The weight of their appreciation was both humbling and overwhelming. In the private lounge, Harrison joined them after completing the necessary paperwork with airport authorities. The Civil Aviation Authority would need to conduct a full investigation of the incident, which would require interviews with both pilots and key passengers. What happens next? Marcus asked Harrison. Will there be legal issues because I was flying without proper commercial certification? Under emergency conditions, aviation regulations are quite flexible, Harrison explained. You acted to save lives under extraordinary circumstances. The investigation will be routine, focusing on what we can learn to prevent similar situations in the future. Princess Catherine was already on her phone with palace officials in London, explaining the situation and arranging for revised travel plans. Their diplomatic meetings would need to be rescheduled, and security protocols would have to be reviewed in light of the day's events. The palace wants to issue a commendation for your actions, she told Marcus after ending her call. This kind of quick thinking and bravery under pressure exemplifies exactly why you were selected for royal protection duty. Marcus felt uncomfortable with the attention and praise. His military background had taught him that you simply did what needed to be done in emergency situations. The fact that his actions had saved lives was reward enough, though he was beginning to understand that the story would follow him for the rest of his career. An airline representative arrived with updates about Captain Reynolds' condition. He was stable and conscious at the hospital, with doctors optimistic about his recovery from the heart attack. The quick medical attention he had received, made possible by their emergency landing, had likely prevented more serious complications. He wants to thank you personally, the representative told Marcus. The doctors say he should make a full recovery, and he knows that your actions today saved his life. As evening approached in Dubai, Marcus found himself reflecting on the most extraordinary day of his life. He had started the morning as a royal protection officer, whose biggest worry was staying awake during a routine flight. He was ending it as an unlikely hero who had successfully piloted a commercial airliner through an emergency landing. The sandstorm outside had intensified, grounding all other flights at Dubai International Airport. Marcus realized that if their emergency had occurred just a few hours later, the weather conditions would have made their landing impossible. The timing of everything, the captain's heart attack, his own aviation background, and their arrival ahead of the storm, seemed almost miraculous. Ready for the next adventure? Princess Catherine asked with a smile, looking out at the swirling sand outside the terminal windows. Marcus laughed, the tension of the day finally beginning to ease. "I think I've had enough adventure for one trip, Your Highness. How about we take the train next time?" 3 months later, Marcus stood in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing his dress uniform with several new medals pinned to his chest. The Queen herself had insisted on personally presenting him with the Royal Victorian Order for his extraordinary service in protecting Princess Catherine and saving the lives of 149 other passengers. Flight 447 has become something of a legend in aviation circles, the Queen said during the private ceremony. Your actions that day exemplified the very best of British courage and competence under pressure. Marcus had spent the weeks following the emergency dealing with media attention, aviation authority interviews, and requests for speaking engagements from around the world. The story of the sleeping royal guard who became an emergency pilot had captured public imagination globally, inspiring countless articles, interviews, and even talk of a movie deal. Captain Reynolds had made a complete recovery and had personally recommended Marcus for several aviation awards. The airline had offered him a position in their pilot training program, recognizing that his natural flying ability and grace under pressure were exactly the qualities they sought in commercial pilots. "Have you given any more thought to the airline's offer?" Princess Catherine asked as they stood together after the ceremony. Their professional relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship, bonded by their shared experience of that terrifying and triumphant day. "I've been thinking about it," Marcus admitted, "but I'm not sure I'm ready to give up royal protection duty. There's something to be said for knowing that my primary job is keeping people safe, not just getting them from one place to another." The investigation into Flight 447 had concluded with commendations for both Marcus and First Officer Harrison. The report specifically noted Marcus's calm decision-making and excellent airmanship under emergency conditions. Aviation schools were already using their emergency landing as a case study in crisis management and resource utilization. Harrison had been promoted to captain and was now flying international routes for the same airline. He had stayed in touch with Marcus, frequently joking that he was probably the only commercial pilot who could claim to have trained a royal guard to fly a passenger jet in mid-flight. "The media attention has finally started to die down," Marcus observed, looking around the elegant ballroom filled with other award recipients and their families. "I was getting tired of reporters asking me to recreate the landing with toy airplanes." The story had indeed captured worldwide attention. Marcus had appeared on major television networks, been featured in aviation magazines, and received thousands of letters from aspiring pilots and aviation enthusiasts. The most touching correspondence had come from passengers on Flight 447, many of whom had written to thank him for saving their lives. One letter had particularly moved him. It came from an elderly gentleman who had been traveling to Dubai to see his granddaughter get married. The man wrote that because of Marcus's actions, he had been able to walk his granddaughter down the aisle, an experience that would have been lost forever if the flight had ended differently. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Princess Catherine said, leading Marcus across the ballroom to where a distinguished older man was standing with a group of aviation officials. "Marcus, this is Sir Richard Branson," she said with a mischievous smile. "He has a proposition for you." The famous entrepreneur and aviation enthusiast shook Marcus's hand warmly. "I've been following your story with great interest," Branson said. "What you accomplished that day was remarkable, but what impressed me most was how you handled the aftermath. You've remained humble and focused on the team effort, rather than seeking personal glory." Branson explained that his company was developing new pilot training programs focused on emergency response and decision-making under pressure. He wanted Marcus to help design scenarios based on real-world experiences like Flight 447. "We're not just training pilots to fly," Branson explained. "We're training them to think, adapt, and lead when everything goes wrong. Your experience bridges military training, commercial aviation, and crisis management in a unique way." The offer was intriguing, but Marcus had already made his decision about his future. The events of Flight 447 had taught him something important about himself and his calling in life. "I'm honored by the offer," Marcus told Branson, "but I've realized that my skills are best used in royal protection. The same qualities that helped me fly that airplane, situational awareness, quick decision-making, staying calm under pressure, are exactly what makes someone effective at keeping people safe." Princess Catherine smiled, having suspected this would be his answer. "So you're staying with us?" "If you'll have me," Marcus replied. "Though I might need to update my resume. I suppose emergency pilot experience is now part of my qualifications." As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself reflecting on how profoundly that single day had changed his life. He had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed, gained confidence in his ability to handle any crisis, and earned the respect and gratitude of people around the world. The boy who had once dreamed of being a pilot had found his calling in a completely different field, only to discover that those childhood dreams would prove essential when lives hung in the balance. Sometimes the most important skills we develop are the ones we think we've left behind. First Officer Harrison arrived at the reception, having flown in from a route that had brought him to London. He spotted Marcus across the room and made his way over with a broad grin. "Still grounded?" Harrison joked, referring to Marcus's decision to stick with royal protection rather than pursue commercial aviation. "Happily," Marcus replied, "though I have to admit every time I see an airplane now, I remember what it felt like to have all those lives depending on my decisions." "That feeling never goes away," Harrison said seriously. "But it's what makes good pilots great. You carried that responsibility perfectly when it mattered most." As the reception concluded, Marcus walked out of Buckingham Palace into the London evening, wearing his new medals and carrying the weight of an experience that would define the rest of his career. He had learned that heroism wasn't about seeking dramatic situations. It was about being prepared when dramatic situations found you. The sleeping royal guard from row 12 had awakened not just from a nap, but to a deeper understanding of his own capabilities and purpose. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin when we're simply trying to do our jobs, and sometimes the skills we think we've forgotten turn out to be exactly what the world needs from us. 3 days later, Marcus was back on duty, standing alert and watchful as Princess Catherine attended another diplomatic function. But now every time he heard an airplane overhead, he looked up and smiled, remembering the day when doing his job meant learning to fly.